All right, Ruth chapter 1. We've been on this journey here in the book of Ruth. So, Ruth chapter 1, we're going to pick it up in verse 6. It says this. Now Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them. She and her daughter-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud. And they said to her, "We will go back with you into your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me, and I'm going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." As they wept aloud again, then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Naomi, look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. When you die, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, even if death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went out until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Marr, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So we looked last week, we talked about the book of Ruth. We talked about how Ruth was in a time of the judges. In verse 1 it says, of chapter 1, "In the days when the judges ruled." This time of the judges was a time of not only a place of confusion, but all these people would, the enemies were pushing in. God would raise these specific judges up. They would die. The people would revolt. And it was this really nasty cycle of, they would have these moments of victory, and then they would just kind of plummet down to these amazing just misfortunes. They would just turn their back on God. They would go the other way. And so this cycle that the judges represented was just a horrible cycle for Israel. And what we talked about last week is that the book of Ruth, kind of in the midst of all this time of the judges, zooms in on one family. Now, the book of Ruth, while it zooms in on this one family, it zooms in on for a reason. It wants to show God's promise amidst a really terrible, terrible time. What would the promise be? What is God doing? In this time of the judges, is there any hope for us as a people? It just seems like it's very chaotic. So this chapter 1 continues this idea. It teaches us the reality of pain, the difficulty with understanding despair, and the mechanism of faith. So chapter 1 teaches us the reality of pain, the difficulty with understanding despair, and the mechanism of faith. So what do I mean by the reality of pain? You know, when I woke up a couple days ago, I'm pretty in tune with my post-nasal drip. I know it sounds really weird, but I have like really bad allergies. Cats, horses, I just might as well die. Can't ride. I didn't know that until I started riding horses for like camp and stuff, and that killed me. But what I know about my allergies is I'm very in tune to them. And so if I don't take my allergy medicine, normally my eyes start itching and burning. My nose, if you ever see me touch my nose like this all the time, that's my allergies. They're flaring up. And I sometimes don't even realize it. But 2 mornings ago, I woke up and I felt great. And then I started to talk. And then my throat, I just was like, uh-oh, something's really wrong. Pain is an indicator that there is something broken, that the normal function of what you are due from day to day, that there's some break in a rhythm. There's something that's broken internally. And it's exhibited through the nerves being kind of irritated in your throat, just like, wow, this is really not good. But the reality of pain for a lot of us is difficult. The story of Ruth is set in these kind of pain cycles. Globally, it's a political crisis. The story of the judges was that of a political crisis. As a nation, they were feeling a sense of pain. There was an economic crisis. Verse 1 tells us, when the days the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So not only do you have a political crisis of leadership, there's no leadership to be had, then you have an economic crisis. There's no food, we can't feed our people. And in the story of Ruth in particular, there's a family crisis. What do I mean by that? The first couple of verses that we covered last week, verse 2, it says, the man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. We talked a little bit last week in Hebrew, when you name something, it has a lot of significance. Elimelech means, my God is my king. Naomi means pleasant. The 2 children's name, Mahlon, means essentially dying, and then failing is Chilion's name. So something happened in this family. Instead of giving them the name of hope and of future and of covenant and of moving forward, it's a name of death and of failing. Something's wrong in the story. There's disruption, there's pain. And lastly, what we see is not only is there pain in a family, there's economic crisis, a political crisis, there's a personal, spiritual crisis. Verse 20 talks about this. When Naomi comes back home, her name is Pleasant. She says, don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Marr, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. So Naomi says, call me bitter. I no longer want the name of Pleasant anymore. So the reality of the situation in the story right off the bat, here's a family, because of economic and political crisis, seeks shelter in another place. In their effort to seek shelter, what they end up finding is more pain. And in that pain, she loses her family. In the effort that she loses her whole family, she makes a decision to go back home. But she's kind of stuck. What do I do with my daughter-in-laws? How do I deal with this? And then what the end of the chapter tells us, when she comes back home, when she finally cracks through into the land, everybody hears about her coming back. And she goes, I just want one fact to be known. Don't call me Pleasant anymore. I'm very bitter. I'm bitter. And so the reality of pain and recognizing that is a huge, huge piece to not only growing as a Christian, but in realizing that things at times are not right, that injustice is real, that people do wrong things. And so when the reality of pain hits, and especially in the story of Ruth, not only do you feel it as a nation, but you also feel it in your family. So Ruth teaches us the reality of pain, the difficulty with understanding despair. So it's one thing to know that something's not right, but it's another thing with dealing with it. There's a difference. You might recognize, well, yeah, we're in a really bad place, but how do you deal with that despair? How do you make sense of it? I think a lot of times when things happen, the first question we ask is, how does this fit into a larger picture? Why did this happen at this time in my life? And then what happens when pain happens, there becomes normally a causation. What caused this? You know, when I get sick, I ask, who in my family sick already? Viruses take about 48 hours to incubate, so which child's fault is this? You know, maybe one of you. I shook your hand or something and rubbed my nose because of my allergies, and then now I'm done for. But the idea is that we always look for a cause, and then we look for a solution. How do I get rid of this pain? So to realize that for Naomi in this story, there's a lot going on here. And what I mean by the difficulty with understanding despair is Naomi knew her future with this life that she had. Look with me, verse in verse 7. With her 2 daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Now Naomi said to her daughter-in-laws, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud. And said to her, "Will you go back? We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons? Who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up?" And so here's the reality is not only is the reality of pain, but of understanding you can't make it better. It's done. Naomi came to this place of understanding despair. And one of the things that might not make sense is that culturally going on right now is that a woman's job, if you will, or there wasn't really a lot of like jobs that she could work. It's a very patriarchal society. And so one of the things, though, that families were central into this way of living because they would have children. Children would make workers. They would also show a sign of wealth and health and also of blessing. So one of the highest things that you could do in your role would be a wife. And so what's Naomi's plea to them? Go find a husband. Go fulfill what God's called you to do in your role as a person on this earth. Because I don't have that. I can't even offer that to you. It is kind of weird what she said is, especially in an individualistic culture that we have. But what happened would be the responsibility of Naomi was to provide children so they could remarry. This is kind of a theme, part of the society, how they worked. And Naomi's like, even if I was to marry, there's despair at the other end. I can't provide for you. I'm so sorry. I can't do it. Even if I had a husband tonight, would you really wait for him? So what Naomi is getting at is she's saying to these 2 women, her daughter-in-laws, go fulfill what God's called in your life. Go back to your people, to your mother's house. Go be a wife to someone. Fulfill your calling, have a family. Do those things. And so part of this here is the difficulty with understanding despair. She realizes she has nothing for them. She can't offer anything. She's probably going to go back to a piece of property at her home that really won't even be hers anymore because of the name of her husband. So she's walking back into a place of difficulty. She knows that. She has a right to protect these 2 daughter-in-laws. She can't do that. So she releases them. And so the idea is not only is pain a reality that we deal with, that we feel, there's another reality of dealing with the despair that pain leads you to. You can't do anything about it. You can't. So what you see here and what Naomi has to do is she has to let go. And part of it in the story, the beginning of chapter 1, there's a lot of words right here that talk about crying. Verse 14, as they wept aloud again, then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. The reality of despair, when you talk to people about despair, listen, I have nothing to offer. I'm sorry. The reality of pain is here. They take a moment together, they cry together because they realize this is the end in the relationship. And so Orpah goes back to her mother-in-law, but Ruth makes a different decision. She clings to her mother-in-law. It's a pretty strong word to cling. It would be, in some instances, it's used to, for a husband to cling to his wife in Genesis 2:24. It's kind of that idea. It's a really strong word. And so the imagery is she kind of locks onto Naomi and says, I understand you have nothing for us, but I'm going back with you, not for what you have for me. So there becomes this story where, am I supposed to fill my cultural responsibility to have a family and have children, to bear the weight of a nation, to help us in that sense? This is my civic duty. This is my cultural duty. And in the midst of that, did Orpah do the wrong thing? I think what the text is showing us is that Naomi is at a spot where she realizes she has nothing to give them. She leaves that reality with them, and they both have a choice to make. Ruth clings, Orpah, all together they both cry. She goes back. So in this, Naomi also, in this, she then speaks about her situation. Verse 21. When she comes back, she says, I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. And so the reality of despair is that no hope, no future, not fulfilling anything, and I'm coming back into a place with nothing to offer. And despair is rough. Despair it can be grinding like sandpaper on you. Despair, in the sense where Naomi's at when she looks out at the plain ahead of her, that's all she sees. The reality of pain has caused her to look to the future with her family and has nothing to offer them. Perspective is one of those weird things that we sometimes never get to experience. And a lot of people they say when you have perspective, and to get perspective, you need to change your vantage point. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. There's times I remember with my kids, we would actually take them flying. I'm not a pilot, but we'd go in a little plane over at Albert and go up and go around. If you were to go out to the beach, maybe in the summertime, and you were to go out there on the beach, not during red tide, of course, but you're going out there and you're playing in the water and those type of things, your perspective is really essentially of the horizon. You kind of look out. It's Tampa Bay, so it's really murky. You're not going to be able to look in the water too deeply. But I realized when I was flying in the plane, and it was with one of my kids, and you're in the plane and then you look down and you look at the beach, you actually see sharks swimming. You actually, from a different perspective, you're like, wow, that doesn't look safe. And what ends up happening is when you change your vantage point, a lot of times you see a different perspective. So for Naomi, the vantage point that she could only see at this spot is not only I went away with 2 children and a husband, have a larger family, now I'm coming back with none of that. And the reality of what despair does is it causes us by nature to be tunnel visioned. It forces our eyes on a horizon, and when we see the horizon, it's cloudy, it's murky. I remember one of the most scariest times for me in diving, which I don't do a lot of diving anymore, probably will never do that again. But in diving, there's a thing. I remember my brother and I, we had this boat, and we're trying to go get our anchor back. Like pros, we lost the anchor. And so we're by the Skyway Bridge. I know there's a lot of sharks there, so it's kind of stupid anyway. So he's like, okay, it's your turn. I'm like, my turn? He's like, yeah, you got to go down and find the anchor. I'm like, what do you mean I got to go down and find the anchor? So I said, oh, Lord. So I put all the stuff on, got my scuba stuff on. I'm like, this is a bad idea. And so I remember the boats, we had, mind you, 2 other anchors holding the boat. This is a bad idea. So I go down, and all I could think about is getting bitten by a shark. I don't know why, but it's all I could think about. So I'm breathing incredibly heavy. It's about 20 feet deep underneath the Skyway Bridge. I've been probably under all the bridges in St. Pete. So I'm under the Skyway Bridge, and you can't see anything in front of you. And all I'm expecting is a shark just to hit me. That's all I'm thinking about. And so it's about 20 feet deep, and you have this device that lets air out in your jacket to go further down into stupidness. And so I'm going down, and I'm starting to panic. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is not good. And I finally, what you end up seeing is you see a clearing. I mean, you're talking visibility is only a couple of feet in front of you. At this point, I don't really care about the anchor at this point. So I make it all the way to the bottom. I look to the left, and actually underneath the Skyway, they have that they're all kind of rounded. There's these big round pillars underneath that we call them the dolphins. There's these big circle things. And when you go down underneath it, you see there's all these rocks and stuff and all this fish. We can't catch them, but they're just scooting all around all the pillars and stuff like that. I look left, I look right, and I take my BC, and I just start filling it up with air, not to get hurt, but I go right back up to the top. Nope, couldn't find it. Get me out of here. But what ends up happening, I know, in diving is one of the most freakiest moments is that you have no visibility. Visibility makes everything all right. If you're in 70 feet of water and you could see 20, 30 feet out, you're good. But going down and just keep going down with the sense of where's the bottom, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying. And so my point is that with Naomi, she sees no end to how this plays out well. She sees no end. So what she starts to do is she starts to dive in and push into her faith. And there's two mechanisms of faith that are here in the story. The first mechanism of faith is Ruth, and this is what happens. Ruth, she demonstrates her faith through action. Verse 14, as they were crying, Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. See, Ruth knew that going with Naomi, you're going as a woman into another country, you're a foreigner. Not only that, you have no provision. You know she can't offer you any children to marry. You really are, this is really a bold step. You look at the visibility in the water and you can't see anything. So what she does, instead of going back home where she knew this probably safe or whatever like that, she makes a decision to cling to her mother-in-law. And in the clinging, she's basically saying, hey, there's something that I believe will happen with going with you, and I'm going to stay with you. That's my commitment. And so Naomi, or Ruth, when she looks at this, she demonstrates this faith by action. The second thing here in verse 16, but Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. What Ruth is doing at this moment, she's a Moabite. She has her gods that she worships. She is actually, her faith is now demonstrated not only through action, through clinging, but that clinging is the response of her heart. She goes, Naomi, I know about your God, and he's going to be my God. I'm rejecting my gods of my land, and I have this conversion. Something happened in Ruth's heart. I mean, it only makes sense, because if she were to look at the horizon in front of her, nothing was there for her. Nothing. She had better luck staying at home, finding a husband, fulfilling her civic or cultural responsibility by bearing kids and raising families and things like that. So her going there is actually kicking against culture. But something about Ruth at this moment saw something. She clung to her. It became personal to her, and she took a step. And what faith does at times is faith, when you're diving down into the water, you know that the depth finder tells you it's 70 feet. You look at your computer and it tells you you're at 50 feet. By faith, you know there's still 20 feet to go. Everything around you doesn't make sense, but you know where the bottom is. And faith is a result of personal change. No longer will I worship these gods. This will now be my God. My people that I've identified with, that I've been born into, I will now leave them and go to your people. In this clinging, in this for Ruth, she looks at this. Then what it is, she has a tremendous amount of determination. Verse 18, when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So Naomi's like, you know the consequence. You know what lies ahead of us. But come on, let's go. Now with Naomi, it's a little bit different. Ruth's faith was, I know there's nothing here, but I'm going to, by faith, there's something God's changed in my heart. I'm going to move forward. In Ruth, what you'll find is that Naomi refers to God's name, his personal name, quite a bit. For instance, Naomi, when she talks about God, she doesn't use the title for God, Elohim. She uses his name, Yahweh. And specifically, if you look here, I'll show you what it says in verse 9. In verse 8 and verse 9, then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord, anytime you see that, there's two different words it could be, but in this case, when it's all capitalized like that, it's God's personal name. May Yahweh, it's Naomi saying, that's my God. May Yahweh show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husband and to me. May Yahweh grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. So in Naomi's faith, there's this personal connection that she has with God. And what she does here, verse 21, she goes, I went away full, but Yahweh has brought me back empty. And what we know about Naomi's faith is not only that it's personal with God, not only is this something that she believes deeply, she calls him by his name. She's not given a generic title for God. She calls him by his name. I know that Yahweh, he's brought me back empty. And what you see with Naomi is that there's this tension in Naomi's faith. This is what flourishing looks like. This is how I'm supposed to live, but I'm not doing that. And then what she does is when she comes back, and in her faith, what she does is she recognizes God's place. For instance, what she says here, if you look at verse 21, she goes, Yahweh has brought me back empty. Why call Naomi? Yahweh has afflicted me. The Almighty. It would be, it's now what she does is she changes and she talks about another name of God, or another personality, what describes him, Shaddai. She goes, the Almighty, the Shaddai, I mean, and it's kind of weird on how it's translated. I was trying to look it up and to get some more nuance on it, but what she's saying is she's speaking about the attribute of God in the sense that he's all-powerful. Yahweh, the all-powerful, who's over all things, has brought this misfortune upon me. The word here, misfortune, it kind of like, I think it's kind of soft a little bit. It's actually, in Hebrew, it's a lot stronger. It means suffering. The all-powerful has brought suffering on me. So what she's done is in her faith is the reality of pain causes her not to understand what's going on. But what she does know is that Yahweh is all-powerful. And since he's all-powerful, and since he knows all things, that he has done this to me. And then she goes, and because of that, call me bitter. And I think at times for us in our faith, I think there's times when pain before us causes us to blur the horizon. And because of that blurring, what do? We push back into our pain. And there's a level of irony, even in the story. I mean, think about it. Look at the very last line. They went in, the very first line of the chapter says, there was a famine in the land. What's the last line? And the barley harvest was beginning. The contrast, I mean, it can't even be that great. This is a brilliant story. Famine, I went out full. I've lost everything. I'm coming back in Judah when there's a harvest. And what's happening is Naomi is wrestling through in her faith. What does she do? And it's encouraging from her story is she wrestles with God. She knows what he's like. And what she does in some senses, she kind of pushes against him in that way. She says, I'm bitter. I'm very bitter with all of this. The pain has caused me to really be in a place of reeling right now. And everything's really blurry. It doesn't make sense. I'm coming back into a land that has food, but when I left, it didn't have food. That's not right. I've lost my family and my children. That's not right. This using of this word of Almighty, Job talks about this when he defends himself. And he says this in Job 27:2. And surely as God lives, who has denied me justice, the Almighty, the same word Ruth uses, who has made my life bitter. So in some senses, what Naomi is doing is she's hitting the kind of in the sense in her faith, she's dealing with the reality of what's before her. The reality of what's before me has caused me to be bitter. And from her perspective, it looks hopeless. What we'll find out in the rest of the story is how God gives her a new perspective, how God gives her insight and wisdom in her suffering. She doesn't know what's going to happen. She doesn't know what tomorrow's going to bring. They're two poor women moving back into a society, having to scrape for food. I mean, the story is going to get bleak in the times nationally and politically and economically. A lot of things aren't going right. And so this idea of faith, this mechanism of faith, and honestly, faith is confidence. Faith is confidence in what we do not see. Hebrews says this, 11 verse 1. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. Naomi couldn't see in front of her. She had perspective of the horizon. It was blurry, didn't make sense. And what Scripture teaches us about faith is that faith is believing things about God that we know are true. And whether you're looking at the horizon and it doesn't make sense, and the perspective you have is totally blurry and lost, to realize that from God's perspective and from his knowledge and his power, he sees all things. And the thing that I'm encouraged about Naomi's story, not only does she recognize that, she actually pushes into God with her bitterness. She's like, God, I'm bitter, and I want everybody to know that. She will change her story at time, and here's the deal. In the midst that you or I are in the midst of pain, what you don't do is don't try to fix it. Don't try to say, well, I'm going to be better. I'm going to pull myself up. When pain happens and the reality of pain hits you, it blurs your horizon, what will happen is what will come out of your heart, what will come out is what you really believe. What you really believe about God, what you really believe about this life and the life to come. And what happens is pain has a way of signaling to us. Pain has a way of helping us to see things in new perspectives. And I think the story of Ruth is just a beautiful story, though, and what we'll learn more about it is that in Naomi's pain, God's there right beside her. He doesn't leave her, doesn't abandon her. And I think the freedom that we have to communicate to God and to love him, to speak to him, even in our pain, letting him know we have it, knowing that he's almighty, knowing that he really does care for us. I think part of it is when we do that, there is a level of freedom. Because by faith, we're confident. There's a confidence we have, even though it doesn't make sense what's in front of us. And the story, I believe, of Ruth is a story of that confidence and walking in faith in the midst of just a horizon that doesn't make sense. So my prayer for us as a church, my prayer for us as believers is that when you experience pain, don't run from it. And here's the deal, it doesn't make sense. I'm telling you that now. It doesn't make sense. Some of it might be self-inflicted. You've caused it to yourself. Some of it you have no idea where it's coming from. But the idea is that you press into it, and then by faith, you know God's place, how he loves us deeply, he cares for us. And we might not know the answer to why things happen on this side. But what he's promising us is to make him like himself. And that your identity, lastly, is this, not in what culture tells you of having a family and having these things. Naomi left poor. She came back in poor. She had nothing. Socially, economically, she had nothing. I think her land was taken from her. We'll find out what happens. So realizing is that what identifies you as a person is your faith in him, in Christ. He loves you. He'll be with you. Things might be taken from you, but that's not where your identity comes from. It comes from him. It comes from what he's done for you. And so call him. Call on him. Tell him about your pain. Push into it. Don't run from it. Let's pray together. So Lord, I know that as a body, we feel a lot of pain. Lord, and as a church, and even in this transition, there's pain. And I know that, Lord, the tendency for us is to not press into it, but to run from it. And Lord, I think by faith, Lord, you've called us as Christians to not understand everything, but what you've called us to do is to press into you. So Lord, I pray that Naomi and faith, two pictures of faith working through difficulty, would be an encouragement to us. So God, we thank you for this night. We thank you for this church. We pray that you would speak to us and continue to do that. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, I'm going to go home and get some rest, and I'll see you guys on Sunday.